and a very important year. In January this year, the Chinese celebrated the 160th anniversary of their arrival. In February, we celebrated the 250th anniversary of the Burmese Revolt. In March, we observed the 100th anniversary of the Rose Hall Massacre. And that was very significant for me because I was invited to deliver remarks on the Rose Hall Massacre, and then I was uninvited. And 2 days later, I picked up the papers to see if the ceremony took place anyway. This is a remarkable contribution. But I didn't get an opportunity to deliver my remarks. In May, we celebrated the 175th anniversary of the arrival of East Indian immigration laborers. And in May also, we celebrated the anniversary of the arrival of Portuguese immigrant laborers. But we are now in August. On the 1st of August, we celebrated the 175th anniversary of emancipation. The day, of course, which caused the other immigrants to come here in the first place, the Portuguese, Chinese, Indians, West Africans, and West Indians. Yesterday, as I said at another function in Buxton, we celebrated the 179th anniversary of the Essequibo Revolt. And a little more over a fortnight from now, we'll celebrate as Sister Bender said, we'll celebrate the 190th anniversary of the Demerara Revolt, a very significant revolt in which over 200 Africans were slaughtered, and many of the survivors were court-martialed and beheaded. The significant fact is that we seem to be celebrating more revolts and massacres than achievements and inventions. It's something we need to think about. From my point of view, I see this conference as being a very important examination of the evolution of Guyanese history. We're looking at emancipation, we're looking at immigration, we're looking at riots and disturbances. All of these events form a backdrop of Guyanese history. And in my view, they provide the tools for analysis of what is taking place now, and perhaps a prognosis of what we would like to see in the future.
As I stand here at the podium, I'm greeted by a card here. It's my first time seeing it. It says, "Coffee, the face of a revolution," coming in 2013. So that's appropriate. I come up here to be greeted by the brother whose memory we've come to celebrate today. Brothers and sisters, I am truly proud to be here, truly proud to be a participant in this historic gathering to discuss the state of Black African Guyana. This conference is significant, particularly if we look at it in the context of Dr. John Henry Clarke's definition of history. Dr. John Henry Clarke, for those of you who don't know, was a phenomenal African-American historian. He was a teacher and advisor to Malcolm X, traveled throughout Africa, wrote many books, contributed many documents to the retelling of our story. And Dr. Clarke, in talking about history, said that history is the clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. He said that history is the compass that people use to find themselves on the map of human geography. History tells the people who they were and where they were. History tells the people who they are and where they are. But the most important role of history is to tell the people where they still must go and who they still must be. Dr. Clarke said, the relationship between a people and their history is like the relationship between a mother and her child. And for people of African ancestry living here in the Americas, we have been treated like motherless children. So it's important for us to understand that the conveners of this conference declared that this day, Sunday, August the 4th, 2013, is a time for the renewal and empowerment of Black African Guyanese people. That's a profound statement. That's a profound declaration. And if history is the compass that people will use to tell their political and cultural time of day, then that statement says that the historical record will show that the conveners of this conference oriented themselves to a specific time and that they used as their cultural compass to orient themselves to the events of February 23rd, 2013, to commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Berbice Revolt. That's important because we are orienting ourselves to a time when we took control of our destiny and initiated a series of events that changed history forever. If we look back on this historic moment today, what is going to come from this gathering is the convening of a series of conversations and assessments in order to formulate strategic and comprehensive plans of actions, not just to peacefully coexist in a multicultural and pluralistic society here, but to be able to move through this society with a sense of security, equity, and ownership by defining ourselves, by defining our realities, so that we determine how we're going to fit into this society, not on someone else's terms, but our own terms. Because we took the time to determine how we will move and initiate these conversations and make these assessments. So, before we can have any meaningful conversations, we must first define what it is that we want to talk about. And it's been said that whoever controls the definition controls the conversation. So I'm here today to add my contribution by defining a number of key concepts that I wish us to establish as a framework for this and all future conversations about who we are and where it is we want to go. So the first concept I want to define and introduce to some of you, reintroduce to others, is the concept of Sankofa. Sankofa is a Akan word from Ghana, West Africa. And on my daughter's second book that we published when she was 12 years old, we have a picture of my daughter, Landis Browder, holding in her hands the staff of a Sankofa bird. The Sankofa bird is a bird whose feet faces forward, which represents the present moment, but his head is turned back and looks to the past. And in his mouth, this bird holds an egg, which represents the future. So the concept of Sankofa tells us that it is not forbidden to go back and reclaim your past, to understand it, to interpret it, and then to preserve it and pass it on to future generations so that they will have a foundation upon which to stand and live their lives. It is your duty, it is your responsibility to know who you are, to define yourselves for yourself. So we are here today to engage in an act of Sankofa. The second term that I want us to be clear about, to be crystal clear about, is the name of the person that we are commemorating with regards to the 250th celebration of this Berbice Rebellion. His name is Kofi, K-O-F-I, Kofi, not coffee, Kofi. What is Kofi? Kofi is an Akan word from Ghana, West Africa. It is a day name given to male children who are born on Friday. So just by this brother's name, we can begin to associate him with a specific landmass on the continent of Africa, a specific culture, a specific language, and we know the date that he was born. So by engaging in an act of Sankofa, we can begin the process of freeing our minds and reclaiming our story. And we should never, ever allow anybody to redefine the personalities who have shaped our history. Because that is what free and self-determining people do. The third point that I want us to examine, our third cultural frame of reference, is to know, is to understand, and to live your lives knowing that Africans were not slaves. We were not slaves. Throw that thought out of your mind. We were human beings. We were leaders. We were healers. We were astronomers. We were engineers, architects, social scientists, philosophers, agrarians, mechanics, artisans who were enslaved by half-human European sons of female dogs. So let us understand very clearly that these have human beings. Because you can't be a human being to steal other people, to enslave other people. That act in and of itself is a declaration of your absence of humanity. So Thomas Jefferson gave us a definition of black power. One drop of black blood makes you African. That's power. So if we go by Thomas Jefferson's definition, then we can say categorically, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there were 5 presidents before Barack Obama who had more than one drop of black blood. And by Thomas Jefferson's own definition, they would be classified as black. So Barack Hussein Obama is not the first black president of the United States. He's the first obviously black president of the United States, because the other 5 black presidents weren't light enough to pass for white, which is exactly what they did. So when you know your story, you can be very clear about what's going on. You can be free from the games that others will play in order to hold you in a state of culturally suspended animation so that they can continue to manipulate you any way that they desire. But those days are over. You all have come here today to make a mental declaration of independence. And in making that declaration of independence, you're going to celebrating the 250th anniversary of Kofi's revolution. This conference is the beginning of a series of conversations that will be held where you will talk about things that are important to you, establish a framework to determine how you wish to move forward in this society. Not begging anybody for anything, but standing up and demanding and taking, if necessary, what is rightfully yours. So I want to close by reciting a poem from my first book on the Broward File. It's a poem entitled Transition 13, and it speaks to the significance of the number 13. This is the year 2013. This is the year of spiritual transformation. And the number 13 is a number that represents the process of spiritual transformation. Now, you cannot expect the people responsible for turning our world upside down to tell us the truth about our reality. They will always camouflage it in lies, in superstition. We've been taught to believe that 13 is an unlucky number. The Friday the 13th is an unlucky day. So many people have bought into this lie and this falsehood that in America, most buildings don't have a 13th floor. Most theaters don't have a 13th row. Most airlines don't have a 13th seat. So we've been socialized to believe that 13 is an unlucky number. But if you look at the history of the United States of America, we will see that the history of this country, the most powerful nation in human history, is replete with the repetition of the number 13. America was founded with how many colonies? 13 colonies. No? The Great Seal of the United States of America has on the reverse of the Great Seal a pyramid which is comprised of 13 courses of stone. The front of the Great Seal of the United States is a symbol which every president of the United States stands behind. And that symbol is an eagle. And in his right talon, the eagle holds an olive branch which has on it 13 leaves and 13 olives. In the other talon, the eagle holds 13 arrows. On the eagle's chest is a shield with 13 stripes. In the eagle's mouth is a banner with the words E pluribus unum, comprised of 13 letters. And above the eagle's head is a cluster of 13 stars. So when you see something repeated over and over again, somebody is trying to tell you something. And the key is, do you have the consciousness to know what they're not telling you overtly, but what is suggested? The number 13 is the number that represents the process of spiritual transformation. So I'm not going to go into all of it right now, but you can read my books and I'll lay it all out. But I wrote this poem entitled Transition 13. Transition 13 says, in the beginning, we knew not, and we studied, and we learned all there was to know, and we taught others. But then we forgot what we had learned, and then forgot that we had forgotten. So now, we come together in events such as this to study and to learn all there is to know. And the question is that we are confronted with is, will we forget again? I'm certain, based on what I've seen in the program for today's conference, based on what I felt from the spirit of our African ancestors here in Guyana, that they will not allow you to forget. They will stir you from your sleep, and they will remind you that the spirit of Kofi, they will remind you that the spirit of George G.M. James, they will remind you that the spirit of Dr. Ivan Van Sertima is here, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be acknowledged, so that these brothers and sisters who are part of a phenomenal cultural revolution can use you as the vehicles to continue their great and mighty walk, and see to it that the people of Guyana are given the freedom, the justice, and the equality that they so rightfully deserve. Ashe?
I think I was set up first of all by David, who invited me to speak on women and violence, which does not seem to me a topic that most people in the room came to listen to. I think I was then set up by Magda Pollard, who said that since I, got onto the agenda, I must make sure I defend women, basically. I'm set up by Charlene, who has put herself right in the front there so she can disagree with me to my face. And I'm set up by Royston, who introduces me as a women's rights activist. That actually is something that came from the newspapers. But women's rights activists, to me, would suggest that I want women, I don't want women to have rights instead of men, any more than I want black people to have rights instead of anybody else. I think that a vision of where we want to go. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention that David also said I have 25 minutes, and I'll try to cut that to about 18, because he was wrong, but that's not my fault. I believe that the vision of where we go from here must include both of the following. It must include identification of differences that can be overcome, and a commitment to working on them, differences among us. And it must include identification of differences that can't be overcome because they are expressions of real, competing, antagonistic differences in access to power. And in relation to those real, competing, antagonistic differences in access to power, I think our vision must include a commitment to stand on the side of those with less power. So it's against this backdrop that I want to speak on the topic I was given, which is women and violence. And to follow the advice that I discuss violence in its wider sense, I'm going to briefly discuss two kinds of violence against women: physical violence and economic violence. On physical violence, as we can tell from media reports, violence against women is prevalent in all communities. The most recent evidence was the August 1st report on the murder of 2 children and critical injury of their mother in Zila. The August 2nd report of serious injuries to 2 offspring, they're not children, and their mother in Sophia, along with what seems to have been a young grandchild. And then on August 3rd, yesterday, Demerara Waves reported what they called an alleged murder-suicide involving a man and his wife in Mahaifa. The murder apparently committed with a knife. In the first 2 cases, the women and the other victims were chopped. In the 3rd case, it was stabbing. 2 of the men have apparently committed suicide. Now, they're really, to the extent that we have statistics from police, from everywhere else and so on, there really is no evidence at all that there's more domestic violence in African Guyanese households than there is in Indian Guyanese households or indigenous households. The differences you find are only sometimes in what weapon is used, because people tend to use, except where it is planned, people tend to use the weapon that is to hand. And the weapon that is to hand is often something that is used for your work. So, cutlass, hammer, and so on. There's a little bit of difference in the reasons for the violence, the immediate reasons for the violence, but by and large they're the same. The woman didn't do something she was supposed to do. The woman insisted on doing something that you said you mustn't do, or you hear that she got somebody with you. So domestic violence is not a problem confined to African Guyanese, but it is a problem among African Guyanese. I wanted to bring, but I couldn't find, an image from a Red Flag video on domestic violence. It is the image of a woman, an African Guyanese woman, scrubbing clothes in a tub with the stumps of her arms left after her hands were chopped off by her husband. David Hines, David, I'm sorry to quote you so often, but you're talking plenty. David Hines was quoted in Kaieteur News and Emancipation Day as saying, quote, as a slave you were a commodity, you had no rights. The master, if you behaved bad, could cut off 2 of your fingers and that's it. Nobody charged him for anything. Well, today, if you chop off all 10 of her fingers, you can be charged. But the victim is still not likely to get justice. Whether it's because of indifferent police, bad police work, sorry Nigel, extremely clever defense lawyers, usually more accessible to the perpetrator. That's not entirely fair, he helps us sometimes. I mean, left to me, I don't care what anybody tells him about, you know, it's like my father who was a doctor telling me about Hippocratic oath. I don't care. If they have some equivalent oath among lawyers that say that everybody's entitled to defense, I think it's the most immoral position that everybody's entitled to defense. A lot of people are entitled to nothing at all. If you ask Sonia, the woman in the video, whose sight was also damaged from chops to her face, if you asked her the state of Africans in Guyana today, in spite of all the other exploitations and discrimination she struggles against, as you might expect, living without hands and with bad eyesight won't be far from her mind. It determines how long each task of housework takes. It determines whether she can get wage work. It determines whether if she heard about today and she came, anybody would give her training or a loan because she's probably not able, without hands, to run a business. It determines whether the impatient conductor is going to allow her on the minibus. It even determines whether any man will want her. All of those things, I think she's legitimately concerned about, as much as she's concerned about the things that come straight from discrimination on racial grounds. Violence between men and women is the most daily expression of intra-race conflict and division, not only among us, but all races. In the 1970s, when I lived in the United States, we used to be told that that conflict was not important, that it should be set aside or at least postponed rather than quote unquote divide the race. My point is that violence against women is an expression of an existing division. It's not that raising the issue is a cause of division. The violence is product and producer of a weakness, a fault line in a community. And for any community to be strong, the fault line would have to be addressed, if possible removed. But that's not seen as a central issue. Trivializing of violence against women is everywhere. Women does beat men too. Women does lash men with a tongue. I hear the screaming, but I didn't take it for nothing serious. I think he did only beating she. Worse, it is trivialized on all sides by people who have larger, more national concerns. In Grantley Waldron's program the other night, someone repeated, David, it was you, repeated Ravi Dev's famous quote that while African Guyanese externalize violence, Indian Guyanese internalize violence. It strikes me every time I hear it that as we object to the comment on African Guyanese, that is that we externalize violence, we fail to note that the comment on Indian Guyanese suggests that male violence against women would be an example of internalized violence. It's inside the race, so it's internalized. One person chops off another's hand, but that is internalized. That's true only if you think that if violence is not across race, it's a smaller violence. So the attitude that relegates violence against women, except when it crosses race lines, to a position of lesser importance, fit to be addressed just by a category of persons called women's rights activists, is not limited to African Guyanese, but it is very prevalent among African Guyanese. Please do not allow that attitude to shape whatever resolution comes out of today's discussions on the way forward. In fact, although I was asked to speak only on violence against women, please take all intra-family violence seriously, including, of course, violence against children. I know that we are never going to agree, so I'm not even going to raise it, being a semi-coward. We're never going to agree on the question of corporal punishment. The last time I argued with people about corporal punishment, male people of my generation said that, you know, the beating is, the licks is a good thing because that's why they come out so good. And when I put it to them that they have not come out good, partly was a shock and a surprise. So there's corporal punishment. Even if we don't agree on that, which I would find very sad, there would still be fundamental problems deriving from how capitalism, and most clearly unregulated, unbridled, unrestrained, predatory capitalism works. How it is set up to work even when racism is not the prime motivator. The role played by IMF policies, which here we call structural adjustment policies, which the ERP was, and in Europe they call austerity. We know that these policies are not class neutral, but we seem to ignore the fact that they're also neither race neutral. In Guyana, cuts in the public sector put many African Guyanese out of work, nor gender neutral. When you cut public spending on things like hospitals and so on, you increase the on-wage caring work that is done mainly by women. So ending the corruption, nepotism, and so on would not by itself solve the problem of what is happening at the level of the household economies of poor people. My same colleague Wintress, whenever she hears on the news that our Minister of Finance has said that the country's macroeconomic fundamentals are strong, Wintress says, well, my microeconomic fundamentals not doing so good. This is the economic violence which is assaulting African Guyanese women in particular. It is not that there is no economic violence against grassroots women of other races. Of course there is. It is not that there is no economic violence against grassroots men. There is plenty. The situation of working class African Guyanese men is dire. But the economic violence against poor people has a particularly severe impact on African Guyanese women and therefore on African Guyanese children because of the level of responsibility African Guyanese women have for the survival of children, which is not new, but which is operating now in changed conditions, and I'll come back to that just now. In October 2012, I had a letter in the press responding to an article celebrating a 39-year-old single mother. She was a single mother of 5 boys, security guard, sweeper cleaner, drainage worker, including on Sundays, maker and seller of pointed brooms, grower and seller of plants, and maker and bottler of products like pepper sauce with other women. That's one woman. She has no electricity, which means that most household tasks take longer. Her workday adds up to at least 20 hours, not counting many of our household tasks, including checking that the children have done the tasks they're assigned to do, that they've attended the lessons she sends them to impart, so they will be quote-unquote meaningfully employed while she earns money, $10,000 of which goes to pay for the lessons, and all the other tasks of raising 5 boys aged 9 to 13 not to become statistics of failure. She also takes home economics, maths, and English classes in the hope that they will lead to better paid jobs. And yet, I remember on the day that I wrote that letter saying, good God, the woman does not need more work, she needs more money for less work. People started calling me to congratulate me. I said, well, what are you congratulating me on? They said, well, for coming out and saying what a fine example of African womanhood she is. For every mother who manages to ensure that her children don't become statistics of failure at whatever cost to herself and them, there's a larger number of mothers who don't succeed. They're all around us. In the main, they fail not because they are worthless. To say that they're examples of the continuing legacy of slavery doesn't make any sense, because if that was the whole story, then why is the situation worse, as we can all see that it is? No. They are continuing victims of a way of organizing the economy which creates poverty and then criminalizes it, which imposes on poor families a choice between being superhuman or being beaten down by inhuman conditions, which destroys family without care. Today, via a massive migratoriness of labor, in a world where capital can travel freely but not labor, and where labor therefore migrates under conditions that is tearing families apart. There is something in this region called the CARICOM single market and economy, free movement of people, which they grandly extended last year, I think it was, to artisans and domestic workers. The problem is that there are no CARICOM governments that are willing to introduce the mechanisms that they have to introduce if the children are to be able to migrate with the mother or the father and go to school. They wouldn't do it. And therefore, the whole of Barbados, Antigua, everywhere you turn, is filled with Guyanese women and men, all of whom have left their children behind. For me, these are root causes, which requires that we look at the solution where it belongs. A Sabbath News editorial of October last, which salutes 2 mothers, the one we just heard about, and the other newspaper vendor, who, it said, scrimped, saved, and scraped to send her 3rd child to university and law school. That editorial seemed to be proposing that we can end poverty by individual sacrifice, which, according to the editorial, can start a quote-unquote revolution against poverty. That's because they're not poor, they could write that. On August the 2nd, 2013, less than a year later, the media had another report on the same woman. She is the mother in Sophia, whose husband shot her and the children on Emancipation Night, including the one that she scraped and saved to make a lawyer. Even if you do not encounter these women in your daily life, you see them on the TV when someone has interfered further with their ability to earn. Not a living, but a partial living. I was a single mother with 5 children, and now they want to move my stall, and what do they expect me to do? They're vendors, minibus drivers and conductors, security guards, domestic workers, shop assistants or cooks, cleaners or waitresses in a cook shop, sex workers. They work unbelievable hours. They often have no one at home, not even an older child to care for the other children. The other relatives who would once have taken up the slack, including sometimes the other parent, are either somewhere else in the country or out of the country trying to earn money. Worse, we have families without a single resident parent or guardian. Men are part of the huge migrations we are seeing, but more women than men are migrating in the Caribbean today. We have mothers who are catching their hand in another country, while their children catching their tail living on their own, or moving from house to house, because both immediate families and extended families have scattered. In the letter, I went on, quote, only a fool would say that there are no bad mothers among us. Clearly there are, but there are far more who are not. Some succeed in raising their children on the quote straight and narrow and deserve honor. But when we ignore or demonize the others who also deserve our respect, even though their hard work does not lift their families out of poverty, then the mothers themselves, their children, and the whole community, all of us pay, as we are paid. I mentioned that many grassroots women work unbelievable hours. The main reason is another related aspect of economic violence, to which we need to pay attention, the cost of basic necessities. For those who are employed, the minimum wage has just been raised to $35,000 a month for a 40-hour week. Many of the business people who have objected to paying this are employers of women, security guards and so on. Domestic workers tell us that their employers are also objecting. This is regardless of the race of the employer and the race of the domestic worker. Wintress, whom I've already mentioned twice today, pays a rent of $40,000 for a place in a working class area. That's $4,000 more than the new wage that employers think is too high. We are rightly bemoaning what is happening to our children in education. A few women in and out of Redfern have given us figures on what it costs to send children to school. In other words, what is the cost of free education? It is costing them a minimum of the monthly equivalent of $11,000 per child, for uniforms not covered by the uniform voucher, exam fees not covered by government subsidy, textbooks, internet access. Every day these children get housework, demanding that they go, homework, demanding that they go on the internet, assignments and lessons. Basically, what is happening is that if you are either well off enough, or if you are poor, if you are determined enough to drop the expenditure on the food and put it on the education, then your children have a chance of making it. If not, then your children have no chance of making it, because we cannot afford the cost of the education. So lastly, I understand when people say that the solution is shared governance. It's to create a bulwark against the racism. But the vision on the way forward should not dwell only on governance for at least 3 reasons, which I'll close by putting in the form of questions. Question 1, can we really ask working class women, children, and men to wait for new governing arrangements before more than a handful of people will support their struggles against the various forms of violence, destroying their families and their communities? Question 2, from where will you draw the militants to struggle for shared governance when your potential militants are consumed by the struggle to survive, demoralized because they struggle with so little support? And third, surely to inspire a movement, because a movement is what we need, the vision of the way forward must describe a future in which priorities are radically different from those which have shaped Guyana for almost our whole history. Surely we need what the sister called a vision of liberation. And if you make that vision of liberation from the point of view of Sonia, the African Guyanese woman washing clothes with the stumps of her hands, then what becomes clear is that the vision of liberation must be able to encompass not only what has to be done for racial equality and racial equity, but what has to be done in order to end every other kind of injustice at work in Guyana, whether it be on the basis of sex, or on the basis of class, or on the basis of race.
Today is the first day that I actually get to speak before somebody that I've respected since I was a little kid in school. I always thought I'd be following Andaye, but today I think I'm helping her forward, so Andaye, I have to at the start say respect you. Brothers and sisters, when I was asked to deliver a presentation, it wasn't on police brutality, it was on the state of the African Guyanese. So that is in essence what I'm going to address as we move on. When I was invited to deliver this presentation for about 20 minutes on the state of African Guyanese, it crossed my mind that it could probably be defined in a few words, which were desperate and heading to hopelessness. I do not pretend to be an academic by any stretch of the imagination, so I'm saying in advance that the views I express here are those of my own, and they're without the benefit of any field research. I propose briefly to look at 5 principal areas of African Guyanese reality in contemporary Guyana. Our mental state, our economic state, Mr. Greenwich did an excellent job on that, I'm just going to touch on some aspects of it. Our educational state, the state of the family unit, and our capacity to redefine and reorder ourselves so that we are competitive and successful for the next 2.5 decades. I'm going to deal with our mental capacity, our mental condition first, and I want to term this segment the danger of dependency. Permit me to share with you a quotation from Nicholas Brandon, and it says, and I quote, "If implicitly we teach our people victimhood as the core self-identification, we are not teaching self-responsibility. We are teaching dependency and impotence. The danger is that they will feel somebody has to do something, and that if the rescuer does not come, they are doomed," unquote. It is a matter of historic record, recently confirmed by statistical data, that the current administration and its predecessor for the past 20 years have pursued policies and interests which are hostile to the interests of African Guyanese, and the prospect of change on this front at the present moment is marginal. This relentless state of affairs has led consciously and unconsciously to the adoption of various overt and covert defenses and survival mechanisms which rely heavily on the victimhood syndrome. Our own definition of ourselves in contemporary Guyana contains significant reliance on victimhood without hope. Young African Guyanese currently grow up in an atmosphere which encourages self-imposed restraints on their aspirations. They no longer believe that they can aspire to reach the summit of any of their chosen field of endeavor, whether it's business, professional, social, or political. Perhaps more distressingly, our collective surrender to the assumption that the present state of affairs is immutable and incapable of change has persistently encouraged a rapidly increasing sense of limited aspirations. Whether this is driven by or because of our exclusion from the corridors of power and the corridors of decision-making is a matter of debate. Perhaps we have traditionally placed too much reliance on political power as the solution to the challenge of building a strong African Guyanese community. What are the lessons of power and powerlessness of the African Guyanese since independence? One of the questions that we must ask ourselves is how have we managed power? How have we managed to distribute it? And how have we utilized power when in government? And how have we handled the lack of power and the lack of control of the reins of power out of power? Was too much emphasis placed on the political kingdom and little, if any, on the economic kingdom? Was there too much emphasis on allegiance and too little on self-reliance? Did we develop a system to hold our leaders accountable? And more importantly, have we developed a system to hold our future leaders accountable for the next 40 years? have we attempted to hold a full, frank, and candid discussion, devoid of either bitterness or adulation, on the real impact of the burning years on the African Guyanese. What state were the African Guyanese in after 28 years of a government which enjoyed primarily African electoral support? Were we on the same page as the rest of the non-African Guyanese when we considered nationhood and the vision of Guyana of one people, one nation, and one destiny? Perhaps most critically, when there is change in the electoral configuration of this country, which I know will be soon, are we prepared, and what do we do differently? And for me, most importantly, what do we do so that we can grow strong, progressive communities, irrespective of whether or not we're in or out of political power, but particularly when we are out of political power? Most of all, most of us can recite the words of Redemption song probably in our sleep. It is perhaps the national anthem of the people of African descent in the Caribbean. But do we really have a vision of what mental emancipation looks like? Do we really have a picture of what it is like to truly fly unhindered, uncluttered, in full control of, and with full responsibility for our own destiny, and walk without the crutch of victimhood forever enticing us into the past? Our academics, our political leaders, our artists, who have so eloquently and fearlessly during the quest for independence created a vision of not only a new Guyana, but a new Caribbean, seem to have gone mute or consider it politically correct to be mute. And those of us who remain in the sidelines have no words and should ponder on the words of the revolutionary proclamation of the Junta in La Paz when they said, quote, we have maintained a silence closely resembling stupidity, unquote. It is my hope today that we consider the highway to the true redefinition of ourselves in contemporary Caribbean and the wider world society, our economic state. Perhaps the area of our greatest failing is lack of economic development, and the decimation of our productive base and productive communities is widely known. Our failing, no doubt, has been significantly contributed to by the openly biased policies of the administration, which has concentrated its efforts on the significant enhancement of the welfare of its traditional supporters to the exclusion of the rest of Guyana. A statistic which has stuck with me since we were conducting work on the Jack Leon Kissoon libel case is that of 64 acres of prime commercial property in Georgetown, transferred by the government, in particular NISL, to the private sector, only 1.1 acres was transferred to persons of African descent. As a matter of fact, only 2 persons of African descent got land. Notwithstanding the blatant biases of the government, we have failed to effectively organize ourselves in the area of economic development. You pick your field, whether it's medicine, law, construction, sea defense, pharmaceuticals, road building, IT, communication. Even in sport, there is no field in which we occupy the upper quartile. There is no village in this country of African descent, or which is occupied predominantly by people of African descent, which is known for its unrivaled competitiveness in any field of economic development. A simple survey of where the successful rural markets are located will tell you the story. Here is an interesting statistic from America. The average dollar leaves the African American community after 1 transaction, the Asian American community after 9 transactions, and the Caucasian community after 8 transactions. We have lost one of the most basic lessons of economics. You first have to build strong, competitive local communities before you can expand and grow outward. And just as a matter of interest, the average dollar in Guyana leaves the African community after 2 transactions. We have to attack this on several fronts. We have to take care about how we spend, where we spend, and consequently our businessmen and businesswomen have to ensure that they are competitive, that they produce products of the highest possible quality, and that they produce products that are without competition. The challenge of growing the economic base of a contemporary African Guyanese community is a complex but critically urgent one. How do we elevate ourselves out of poverty? The level and quality of skills generated in our community is low. The available capital resources of the community is extremely limited. How do we build capital resources? We start by generating income and from saving from that income. We then have to reduce spending, then develop the habit of running successful businesses, and after that, and most importantly, we have to create and establish a legacy of wealth. Perhaps easier said than done, but in the new world in which information technology, food security, and water are critical areas of the future, we should perhaps start with these areas. The proximity of African children, especially rural children, to information technology is tenuous at best, and I don't mean Facebook, internet calls, or texting. IT in African communities, other than attempting to erect a relay tower in the football field in Sparendam, and I have to respect Mr. From PNC, who protested, went out there, Mr. Aubrey Norton, for protesting when they put that tower up in the football field in Sparendam. IT in the African communities is an alien topic. Agriculture is probably alien to our community as a result of our concept and vision of agricultural production as back-breaking manual labor, which has its own psychologically peculiar connotation for us, particularly as a people. But much has changed in the area of agricultural development, and much of it is now mechanical, if not electronic. There was earlier reference to that. The food import bill for the Caribbean is $34 billion US. Apart from obstacles to intra-regional trade, is there any rational reason why we could not train ourselves to get part of that pie? We have to repackage agricultural production so that the negative concept of it as hard back-breaking manual labor is addressed. Water. Many analysts fear that the next global war will be over water resources. We may be a land of many waters, but how many of us can boast of being in the business of water purification and sales? On the issue of IT, I propose to address this later when I discuss the issue of education. Our political state. For the past 20 years, African interests have been excluded from Africans have been excluded from the decision-making fora of economic development of this country. The primary reason for this is our Constitution, which vests absolute executive power to create economic and other policies in the executive. It continues to baffle me why we believe that it is possible to run a successful multi-ethnic society in which executive power can be vested in the hands of a minority government without the necessity to include the rest of this country in the executive decision-making process. Yet, the cries for constitutional reform are muted at best. What good is power sharing if the vehicle for power sharing is disenabled? Talking of economic growth without concomitant social economic growth is misleading at best. The CDB in 2013, in its recent visit to Ghana, pointed to the fact that there was impressive economic growth, but it was not accompanied by similar progress on the socio-economic department. This is how the president of the CDB put it. He said, and I quote, "Despite Guyana's economic growth, overall socio-economic development may not have improved significantly." In other words, and to put it very bluntly, don't be fooled by the economic figures trotted out by the Minister of Finance. Your people are still suffering and not getting the benefit of apparent growth. The question, therefore, is who is benefiting from the growth and why are they benefiting from the growth? In the area of political protest, we seem to have been outmaneuvered, outwitted by the government, who have convinced not only their supporters, but have convinced us that political protests are a no-no. We have, by our failure to hold peaceful and disciplined marches, perhaps allowed the government to attribute all manner of evils to those who protest. But it is our responsibility, particularly ours, to ensure that every protest and every political act of opposition is highly disciplined, carefully marshaled, and effective. We should never again permit any march held by the current opposition to be infiltrated, abused, or desecrated. It is too powerful a weapon to surrender to the altar of the government's propaganda. All of us in the political arena, irrespective of where we stand and whichever party we are in, have failed to provide adequate, enlightened leadership to our people, and as a consequence, hope seems to be in the high dependency unit. The hope that a new dispensation was brought in 2006 has been replaced with resignation and perhaps hopelessness. The spark that was lit in Linden, where there was perhaps the spark that was lit in Linden was perhaps the most disciplined, sustained protest for several weeks, and that was reduced to a flicker and is now a burnt out wick in another chapter of missed opportunities. I want to take this opportunity before I go on to salute who I thought was a true leader that was discovered in Linden, and this is cross-party support, and I really want to salute Mr. Sean O'Sullivan for having provided. I have to confess, when I met Sharma in Linden, that was the day, 2 days after the shooting, I felt a sense of absolute hope because finally Linden had somebody of Linden to speak for themselves, and most importantly, every day that we went into Linden, it was the most disciplined, sustained struggle that I have seen by a non-military organization, and I say again to you, sir, respect you. Our educational state. The recent CSEC results disclose many things. First, geography is a determinant in our success. No children from regions 1, 5, 7, 8, and 9 were in the top 1%. Think about it. That's nationally. So when you break that down to urban areas and African areas, no African children were getting into the better schools. A less publicized figure is the number of children of African descent who have matriculated for better quality secondary schools. And of the 16,000 children who leave secondary school every year, what percentage of them who are African Guyanese are functionally literate and employable? I believe we must re-examine the role of schools in contemporary Guyana. 16, 17, 18, and 19-year-old children are making children themselves, invariably in single-parent homes. What happens when the children of these children attend school? Is their social skills may not what we previously have expected, and they may find themselves challenged. So teachers are now asked to teach students who may be socially challenged. Don't believe that the phenomenon of children making children is going to go anywhere in the short term. It's here with us for quite a while. So the next best thing for us to do is to expand the role of the teacher to include social training, and expand the hours in which children are required to be in school so that we can facilitate that additional social training so that they're better equipped when they leave school, so that they're better equipped to either run their own businesses preferably or be employed. We cannot continue to produce more and more functionally challenged students who are ill-prepared for a world where intelligence and information technology are critical to development. I would like to recommend the following for discussion, the following goals for discussion. I think we should aim for all our secondary school graduates to be bilingual by 2025. Every student should be capable of writing applications by the age of 15 and definitely by the time they leave high school. We should teach our children maths and English in a foreign language. We should change the way we teach them so that we teach them to think critically instead of challenging their powers of recall. Particularly in the African community, we have to teach them entrepreneurship so that they appreciate from an early age the importance of self-sufficiency and standing on their own 2 feet. The state of our family. I've earlier alluded to the fact of children making children. And of course, if this is not likely to change in the immediate future, how do we address this challenge in the most positive light? We should perhaps start by providing parenting skills to single mothers as well as the fathers, where they could be found. We need to provide a network of high-quality daycare centers who will provide the best quality care, social conditions, and education for the children who are in its care. We have to create the conditions and incentives to encourage the development of the nuclear family and we have to design, as a matter of highest priority, a radical program to stop our men from falling on the wayside. In order of priority, it should be the individual, the family, the village, and then the nation. And finally, do we have the capacity to redefine and reorder ourselves to be competitive and successful for the next 2 decades? The fact that we have gathered here today is a step in the right direction. But we have a very, very long history of good intentions with little follow-up action. We must truly develop a culture of statistics so that not only will we identify our benchmark today, so that we will look back with some degree of regret and shame as to how poorly we were, but we must constantly measure and track our progress so that we can find out if we are making any movement, and whatever movement we are making is in the right direction. Let us create a register of our state today, so that we have a basis to compare our future actions. And I ask that we commit to start to break the mold today. And in the words of that very famous Caribbean son, perhaps the prophet, may we emancipate ourselves from all forms of slavery.